here, and I'm very excited by the possibility of a major program in the US called AI for Science, and I hope we can do something in the UK to collaborate with that. But that's the background to this. But let me then move on and talk about how things have changed. My colleague Jim Gray, a Turing Award winner at Microsoft, used to seek out scientists who were drowning in data, and he used to help them with some computer science technology to get analysis and results from their vast amount of data. Well, that's continued, and there are some fields which are already up in the petabyte range, like particle physics and astronomy, but other fields are moving there quickly. And of course, there is also the long tail where people just use Excel spreadsheets and so on. I won't talk about volume, variety, velocity, veracity. There are lots of aspects to data, but data is now a major focus for dealing with data, handling it, metadata. All these things are now really important for scientists to know how to deal with. So Jim Gray defined this phase as being different. Previously, we had experimental science since the Egyptians and the Greeks and so on. Since Newton, we had theoretical science that we could actually make mathematical predictions and then compare them with experiment and so on. And since 1950, then when digital computers were invented, we had computational science. So you could actually learn, you needed an algorithm, how approximate a differential equation, and how you program it, and how you actually do it on a supercomputer with parallel programming. So a set of skills were needed for computational science, which were complementary to the experimental and theoretical science. But today, Jim thought we were entering a new phase of data-intensive science, where you needed to have graduate students, yes, who knew about theoretical science, experimental science, and some programming, but they also needed how to handle data, the metadata, the curation, the generation of the data, the analysis of the data. And this is a different set of skills: how you manage a petabyte, how you reorganize it, how you handle big data sets. And so Jim felt this was a qualitatively different thing. It's not covered by the phrase computational science because it involves data and it involves different types of skills than computational scientists. The data comes from instruments, simulations, sensor networks, you name it. And I would regard the e-science program that we did at the beginning of the century as the set of tools and technologies to support analysis, data mining, visualization, exploration. It was really about big data, big scientific data, and the tools you need to analyze this. So where does this data come from? Well, this is where I work. And on this site, you'll see the Diamond light source on the bottom right, which is an X-ray synchrotron. And there's a new facility called the electron microscopy facility, where they do cryo-electron microscopy for both materials and for biology. And both Diamond and the electron microscopy facility are generating very, very large data sets. Diamond's already up in the petabyte range, and electron microscopy is getting huge data sets. And in addition, we have a neutron source, which generates complex data sets, usually smaller. We have a central laser facility, and we also have the particle physics data from the LHC in Geneva is transferred to our Tier 1 computing center for the UK. The environmental scientists run what they call a super data cluster. It's a compute cluster, but uniquely the network connects the processors at very fast speeds and low latency, but it also connects solid state disks, which have petabytes of data. So it actually has most of the IPCC data. It contains Sentinel satellite data. So we have these big sources of experimental data on the Harwell site near Oxford. So, and just to show the machines can get upgraded, so the beam gets more powerful and more intense, so you get bigger data rates. But actually, most of the challenge has come by the data rates from the detectors have been increasing over the last decade or so, faster than Moore's law. And so really the experimentalists now, Jim Gray and I thought when the early 2000s that we were dealing with huge data sets for science, but now they're really an order of magnitude, several orders of magnitude more than that. So that's the first setting the scene, data intensive science, and where does that data come from? There's also been another development in around 2012, and it's what I would call the deep learning revolution. So what's that? Well, machine learning has been around for a long time. And so there are many, many different types of machine learning algorithms. I've listed some of them here. And I've highlighted one, neural networks, and that's the one that is causing a lot of excitement. When I was at Microsoft, one of the projects I funded was for Professor Fei-Fei Li at Stanford. And she set up a project called ImageNet, which, as you can see, was a large number of images on the internet, which she paid people in my Mechanical Turk to annotate and say that this was a Siamese cat, that was a collie dog, that was a car, and so on. So these images, many of these images were annotated with annotations which explained what they were. And this is the deep learning revolution. What was found was simple neural networks have been around for a long, long time, and they have an input layer and an output layer and a hidden layer in the middle, and that enables you to do many things. But what was discovered here was that if you increase the number of layers and train the network appropriately, which you could do, you got much better results. And what I mean by much better results, I mean this. So this is the ImageNet. They had a competition for people with machine vision systems. You could see which was the best one. And so here's the specimen images. So for birds, it wasn't just a bird, it was a flamingo or a quail, and it wasn't just a cat, it was a Persian cat or a tabby cat or whatever. So it was fairly detailed, and on doing these categories, 1,000 categories, millions of images, you could test how well humans can do, and the error rate for human classification was around 5%. But the systems, when they started doing this challenge in 2010, was above 25% error rate, and it was improving a few percent a year. Until 2012, when it improved about 11% in one effort. And that was because they used this deep learning network. And when I say deep learning, it was a network with hidden layers. So it wasn't very deep. And also, they found that it was advantageous to use graphical processing units, GPUs, to do the calculations, to train the system to recognize cats and dogs and things like that. And what's happened subsequently, until the challenge was abandoned in 2017, was that they got more and more sophisticated, and now networks with over 100 hidden layers actually can do as well or better on this particular test than humans. So this was really exciting to computers. This is really one of the tasks they've been trying to do for many, many years. Can you get human error rates on things like object recognition or speech processing? And that's why everybody was so excited by deep learning. This is one of the proponents of deep learning, Andrew Ng, who was at Stanford, and then he ran Baidu's research center in Silicon Valley. This is clearly a marketing slide because there aren't any units on any of the axes, but the point he was trying to make was that it was only when you got to a certain scale of data that the superiority of these neural networks over the other types of machine learning algorithms became apparent. And deep learning seems to get better the more data you have, and obviously the more compute performance you need to do it. So if you have large amounts of compute performance and large amounts of data, deep learning in this supervised way where you have a training set, you can train the data train the network on a labeled set of data, and then you can try it out on unlabeled data and see how well you do. So deep learning is really impressive, and it's used widely in industry. These are just some of the accomplishments that are used daily by all the big IT companies. Image classification we've talked about, speech recognition is another one, handwriting, machine translation, text-to-speech conversion, natural language questions you can answer. We're getting close to autonomous driving. I don't think we've got there yet. Targeting ads, playing Go, which I'll talk about later, and in certain image analysis for medical reasons. So there's a project I'll mention about using machine learning for cancer, for example. So it's already had a very large impact, admittedly in rather narrow areas, but that's where we are in computer science, and that's why all the IT industry is so excited by AI. It's because of these results. Well, so the big data, and science now has big data. We now have machine learning and neural networks really making a real breakthrough. There's also another thing that's coming at the same time, which is the end of Moore's law. So what do I mean by the end of Moore's law? This is a slide from Intel, and it doesn't go up to 2020 because you can see the effects here. And what it shows is that the second curve, not the green one, the dark blue one, it says clock speed flattening sharply. So the clock speed determines how fast you can run the processor, and what's happened for Moore's law to take place, that you made the thing smaller, you shrank the chip and the feature size, and everything got faster and more performance on your chip. But the clock speed cannot be increased. The power has reached its limit, and the number of instructions per clock cycle has also plateaued. So people have done things like multi-core and things which take you a little bit further, but basically the reason you can't put more power in, the chips will melt and so on. There really are limits to Moore's law, and there are ways around some of these things. But you should note also the green curve, although you can't make them faster, you can actually still put more transistors on the chip, because the transistors can still get smaller. You just can't power them up and clock them at a higher rate. So that's what the end of Moore's law meant. And of course, it means we are now in a new phase of computer architecture. And also people now, besides doing high performance computing simulations, they're doing AI calculations. And this just shows two distinct eras of computing usage for AI. So until about 2012, when AlexNet was the Geoffrey Hinton's students, and he wrote this 8-layer neural network, which made the big decrease in error rates for image recognition, object recognition. And it shows here that was a different, because you're now using GPUs, you're doing more computing. And as we'll see, it's a different shape curve. In order to do something like AlphaGo, which we'll talk about, you need a lot more compute power than you would by just extrapolating the sort of Moore's law line. So it's a different region of compute. And this is AlphaGo 0. This is a Go game. I'm very bad at Go. It's a nice game, but it's very complex. And this is what they did in Google's DeepMind operation. That's one started in the UK. It's still in the UK, in London by King's Cross. And they trained AlphaGo on all sorts of traditional ways of training things. But AlphaGo 0 just trained by playing itself. And no human intervention, didn't use any historical data. But you had to run this thing on very large computing platform for about 40 days. And so this is Alpha playing a challenge match against one of the world's best Go players, Lee Sedol, and this shows you the sort of exaflops you need to do that. AlexNet is at the bottom on the left, and up the top you have AlphaGo. So a large amount of compute. So is that the end of computing? No, it's actually at the end of Moore's law has now freed architects to do different things. So we already have floating point units, graphical processing units. We now have a transaction processing unit, TPU, and we also have neural processing units. So you're seeing all sorts of different types of architecture. And in fact, if I look at the chip startup landscape, there's an enormous number of people starting up new designs, new chips, new types of chips. Most of these will fail, but some of them won't. And so just to pick out one, this is Cerebras, which is like a whole wafer. It isn't like a traditional chip. It's got 1.2 trillion transistors, and potentially it can go to 100 to 1,000 times faster than traditional GPUs. So it's actually, post Moore's law, it's a very exciting time for computer architects. So we shouldn't think it's doom and gloom. Okay, so we have the trends, data, we have the breakthroughs in machine learning, and we have the end of Moore's law. And what we should see, how this applies to scientific data. So instead of the big data, which is just the sort of things from Twitter feeds and so on, this is actually using scientific data taken by real experimentalists at these large-scale facilities. Now, I work at the one in the UK, but there are other ones around the world. In Europe, there's the European Synchrotron in Grenoble, and there's a Neutron source in Grenoble. And similarly, in the US, they have labs around the US, which have these big user facilities, which you can't afford at a university. So on this type of data. So what are we doing at Rutherford Lab? Well, we've set up what we call a scientific machine learning group, SciML. And our remit is, when I say AI, I mean, of course, AI and machine learning mainly, but other AI techniques for applied to scientific data. And this goes from the range of material sciences, environmental science, the particle physicists and astronomers are part of STFC, but also the life sciences are clearly an important area. The group is actually part of the scientific computing department. So at the Rutherford Lab, you have the facilities like Diamond and so on, but you also have a computing department which provides services to these facilities. We look after, for example, all the data taken by Diamond, we archive it and so on, and by ISIS. So this is our group, and we have three focus areas. One is to use AI to advance science, to understand results. The other one is to actually help facilities get more efficient. So you can actually use AI machine learning techniques to improve the operation of accelerators and different parts of a beamline where you have different things happening. You can actually improve these by actually using machine learning techniques there. And lastly, we can use existing algorithms, and we can also see where there needs to be improvement, where we need to find out more about why does this result happen? Is it just a black box? How can we do that? So we are trying to also do research to advance our understanding of AI. So let's look at these briefly. AI in science, I've talked about the different fields, chemistry, earth, environmental sciences, biology, high energy physics, and so on. And the current landscape is that we have a large amount of data produced by cryo-electron microscopy, and we're using machine learning there. We're looking at various experiments using neutrons. This is an inelastic neutron scattering, looking at magnetic properties. We're also looking with the Jasmine service. We're looking at Sentinel satellites, trying to detect whether it's a cloud or whether it's actually fog or mist, and can you do better to interpret the images you get? You can get confused by reflections off the snow, reflections off the sea, and so on. Can you distinguish these? There's also some aspects in biology, and also you can denoise some of the data because they're often very noisy data and the signal is quite small. So those are the sort of problems we're looking at. Just to look at a couple, here is cell migration. These cells move around as they sort of form new divide and so on. And then you can actually apply machine learning to that, and you can track them. So this is using tracking machine learning. You can see how these things work, and that's collaboration with Oxford. So, whoops. Neutron scattering. So inelastic neutron scattering here, understanding quantum materials, it's actually quite difficult to, when you give the data, to understand what's going on and where you should look. And what we've managed to see is we can use neural networks to actually understand what are the important regions to distinguish between two different types of model, for example, for this. And so those are the sort of things we can do, and we can actually try and get some understanding of how this works by actually analyzing exactly what are the important parts of the image and comparing it with what an experienced scientist could do. So we do inelastic neutron scattering, smart facilities, higher quality data, faster results, putting AI into all of these things. So experiments, adaptive data collection, fault tolerance, data reduction, lots of possibilities for using AI technologies. And so on-the-fly data-driven control of X-ray tomography. We're working with the Central Laser Facility, looking at damages to the optics and making progress there. And we're also looking at on-the-fly pulse shape determination. So this pulse shape discrimination, can you distinguish neutrons and gammas? We have made a fair amount of progress in looking at problems like that. The other area I'd like to talk about is research to advance artificial intelligence, because we think that's important. We need to understand why the method works and what are the important areas to focus on. Can we understand how it works and so on? And how robust is it to noise, to interference and so on. So lots of problems for AI, and what we'd like to look at to do that, we're going to try and set up a series of AI benchmarks. So AI benchmarks are, I think, a very interesting and important area. And this shows, for example, that you can see how different algorithms can do clustering. And this is from scikit-learn, and you can see which algorithms work best on a particular data set. So they can distinguish which algorithm is best, and you can try and understand why. So what we're trying to do then, there's a whole lot of fields, different fields. There's a whole lot of systems you can use, and there's lots of algorithms. So there's lots of methods, lots of problems, and lots of systems. And so we have to do it in a rather disciplined way to not get overwhelmed. So what we've been trying to do is look at a series of different domains, get a data set, which, because it's a scientific data set with the permission of the researcher, the owner, we can make it public. And that's an important thing. The difficulty is that these data sets, to be usable, have to be rather large. So they can't just use it on your laptop. It's not so easy. But as you can see, we'd like to look at a variety of different types of problem for machine learning, and we need a large and open data set. And what we in our benchmark, we give the data set and we give a reference implementation of an algorithm, and you can see how it performs. You can measure on different hardware and see which hardware is best. You can actually try different algorithms and you can see how they work on the same hardware. So the classification we're looking at is, we have a scientific problem, which can be tracking, denoising, segmentation, and so on. It can be different algorithms, classification, regression, clustering, and so on. And various different types of ways we can classify the benchmarks. So we're still working on that, but that's where we are at the moment. And we've just released a very early pre-release, we call it, of 3 small benchmarks, where we're just trying to work out the bugs in the system, and you can actually go find these and download these from here. So my slides will be up there, and if you want to have a look, please do. So that's what we're doing at the lab, and we're hoping to have a much bigger release with more realistic benchmarks in October. Now, there is an international benchmarking, machine learning benchmarking activity. It's called MLPerf. It has all the major people like Google, NVIDIA, Facebook, all these people are there. And they're looking at things like how good are speech to text, translation, sentiment analysis, recommendation, and so on. Some of which are interesting to scientists, but most are not. So what we've actually set up is a science data experimental working group, and we're having one of our meetings actually later today to explore benchmarking scientific applications. So you have to have an open data set, and you have to have a problem you want to solve, and which algorithm can do it best. So we're trying to go and work internationally. So we'll contribute some of our benchmarks from Rutherford Lab, but we also hope that there will be benchmarks from other laboratories like Argonne and like Jack Dongara at Oak Ridge. So that's where we are on the benchmarking, and we believe that it will actually give us some insights and some handles and some, if you like, a place that you can explore different algorithms and different ways of implementing them and so on. And also you can use these benchmarks as training. And so we've been giving, for example, recently a course on scientific marking for Diamond users and so on. So that's what we've been doing with some of these early benchmarks. Okay, so that's what we're doing at the Rutherford Lab, but we're not alone. And the US Department of Energy, DOE stands for Department of Energy, have already picked up this as well. And so I'll just show a few slides from the three major labs, which are not weapons labs. So Lawrence Berkeley, just up the hill from Berkeley University, and they have a project led by Berkeley, but actually does cross other US labs, called Camera, and it's intended to try and put not just machine learning and neural networks and so on, but all sorts of different applied mathematics. And it's led by Professor James Sephian at Berkeley, and he's a rather innovative character. So this is just a couple of slides from him. What will experimental facilities look like in 5 to 10 years? They'll have faster acquisition and throughput, higher spatial and temporal resolution, which means you'll get much more data. They'll need real-time analysis, robotic control of experiments. You'll also do multimodal experiments. So besides looking at it with X-rays, you'll look at it with electrons or maybe neutrons, and maybe you'll do simulations as well. And so integrated coupling of experiment, simulation, and data analysis. And you want to give the feedback quickly, so you can say, are you measuring the right thing? And you can actually make better use of the time. And obviously you need computing everywhere. So if you have computing at the facilities where the data is taken, it's called computing at the edge. It can go from little sensors to actually big machines, but you also want on occasion to do things on a very big machine. And so you need to link that to a central facility. And the areas where it will be critical, autonomous self-driving experiments, so you can actually set up the experiments and the experiment will tune itself and decide which is the next thing you should do. Data analysis, computer vision across these different modalities. What we'd like to do, instead of just using machine learning and AI algorithms with no knowledge of physics, we'd like to embed physics and physics constraints into these algorithms. And so you can actually have a much more targeted type of machine learning than just using an off-the-shelf algorithm. And another interesting area is that, for example, the particle physicists spend a lot of money in computer time on simulating their very complex apparatus. And that takes a lot of computer time. But if you could actually simulate the data that that simulation would produce, then you would actually be able to save time and you could do much more compute. And it turns out by using things called generative adversarial networks, you can actually create surrogate models which create just as realistic data as your full-scale Monte Carlo simulation. And those are areas which are clearly going to be important in the future. So the broader vision that they have is that real-time analysis of data suggest and perform a new simulation. You have a simulation, you combine the simulation with data, and then you do another experiment. So models and data are intimately connected, and you'll steer experiments by learning from the previous ones. This is Oak Ridge. Oak Ridge is in Tennessee, and it was one of the places where they separated, they had a separating uranium for the bomb program in the war. So they set it up in the middle of nowhere. So that's where Oak Ridge is. And this is a slide from David Womble, who is their AI expert there. He believes we're at a tipping point, data, computing, algorithms, accessibility, and what distinguishes what the Department of Energy does from, for example, NSF in America have been the leaders in funding AI research, but what DOE has, it's the facilities and the data they generate, which gives DOE an interesting point of access for doing AI machine learning research. And I liked the quotation he had: AI won't replace the scientists, but scientists who use AI will replace those who don't. So this is David Womble, and he talks about classification and regression, surrogates, I talked about inverse problems, which is what a lot of people do at these experiments, and then the control and so on. So they're doing very similar things to we've been doing. Strategic directions, they look at data, they look at learning, physics-informed, accelerated learning, foundations of machine learning, and so on. They see also AI in facilities operation, in scaling algorithms and parallelism, and you can, because different parts of your algorithm may not need 64-bit precision, you can do 16-bit precision for some of it, and that makes interesting computing gains that you can make. And then you need to know about what are the errors on this. So you need uncertainty quantification, you need also some explainability, and you need to be sure that your solution is robust to bits of noise and so on. And so, hold on, yes. And then obviously you can construct very complicated workflows which you can automate as well. So, so that's what Oak Ridge are doing. And then Argonne near Chicago, they're going to be the first lab to get an exascale supercomputer, but they've already been looking at different models and different tasks, classification, regression, clustering, and all these things. And they're trying to enable it to different types of applications: virtual drug response, dark sky mining, simulation of the Atlas detector, that's the particle physicist, and so on. And they've looked at the sort of methods you need for these type of problems. This is a sort of an impression of the sort of problems that they've been looking at. Hold on one second. And then this is the surrogates can dramatically accelerate simulations. So you don't do the simulation, you create a surrogate which gives you results which are indistinguishable from the simulation. And that can give you, you may have a petaflop or an exaflop machine, but you can suddenly go much faster than you would do by simulating the data in a Monte Carlo way that you would normally do. So surrogates are really an exciting and important area. They're also looking at benchmarks, and we're working with them on, they call them candle benchmarks. It's a project on cancer, that's what the CAN stands for, that they're doing with the National Institutes of Health, and they're looking at different types of benchmarks for drug response, pathways, and individual patients. Okay, so that's what the US labs are doing. What are we doing globally? So let's see if we can look at a perspective more globally. And this is a snapshot of countries who have AI strategies. So these are Japan is there, the UK is there with the AI sector deal. America, as I will talk about, have an American AI initiative. But the area that the US are concerned about are the vast amounts of money that the Chinese are putting in with their next generation AI. So they have a huge initiative, and it's a very important battleground for, I think, for the Western world in making sure we have parity, at least leadership or parity on AI technologies. So I'm just now going to talk about the US activity. So this is the White House initiative on artificial intelligence. And it's an effort to promote and protect AI technology and innovation in the USA. And it calls for all the funding agencies, that's Department of Energy and NSF, to prioritize AI research and development. And so they also, and this is a nice sentence you might like, a whole of government strategy in collaboration with academia, private sector, the public, and like-minded international partners. So I think there really is an opportunity for the UK to collaborate with the US on a project in this area. And I'll outline what the Department of Energy are thinking of doing. So as a result of that, the 3 labs I talked about, Berkeley, Oak Ridge, and Argonne, organized a set of town hall meetings where they had invited users and beamline scientists and computer scientists to come and give their views about AI for science. AI means a broad basket. It isn't just machine learning, but machine learning is at the moment very popular, but there are other technologies you may wish to use. So this is a snapshot of the meeting in Argonne. There was also one in Berkeley and one in Oak Ridge. And I attended, they had a final wrap-up one in Washington, DC. And they had over 1,000 scientists who participated in the town halls in 2019. And they looked at all sorts of opportunities in many areas. There is reference on that slide to an ASCAC subcommittee report due in May 2020. Well, ASCAC stands for Advanced Scientific Computing Advisory Committee. And actually, I was the chair of that subcommittee, so I can tell you what it says. Actually, I'm presenting it tomorrow to the ASCAC, full ASCAC committee, and I'm hoping that it will be accepted, since it recommends that the US DOE initiate a major program in AI for science. And so these are the sort of, this is that you can get a copy of the proceedings. If you look on the Argonne website, for example, this is the copy of the proceedings, and it has lots of different use of AI for science, but also research to advance AI. And so they have chapters on each of these, and they're well worth looking at. I'm not sure you want to read it from start to finish, but I think there are many things that make you think in the report. And where they see the Department of Energy's role in AI for science is that NSF have been funding AI for many, many years, but what DOE can bring are curated data sets. It has the most powerful computers on the planet. It has maths and computer science research in its laboratories and funds that in collaboration with universities. It has the user facilities. And what it can do in a way that's very difficult for universities or other organizations to do, it can do what they call team science. So you can have all the different types of skills working together on one project. And that's a real bonus that they have. They have this co-design process where you can have people who work on the hardware, people who work on the software, and people who work on the applications. And by getting these people to work together so that they don't produce software which is never used, they have software which is useful, they also have a knowledge of what hardware it will work on. And so this co-design process is really, I think, a very interesting and useful thing. And I don't think we have anything similar in the UK, but maybe we ought to. So what they come up with is a bold vision for AI, Department of Energy. And so these are just some of the things that they wrote down. In 10 years, you'll have learned models beginning to replace data. Your experimental discovery processes will be changed on their heads by using machine learning and models. You can do many of these things semi-autonomously. You can do a whole series of experiments searching for molecules or materials and so on. And simulation and AI approaches, as you saw with the surrogates, they're sort of merging. AI begins to actually generate the statement, theory becomes data for next generation AI. I'm more skeptical of that, but nonetheless, you can see that AI can play a role in advancing theory. And what is true is that AI will be integrated into the science, engineering, and operations of these laboratories in 10 years. So this is the transformation that we're coming to, and it's by the big data, machine learning, and the end of Moore's law are going to really be a nexus which actually makes this possible. So, where are we? So, are we really going to get a transformation of scientific research? Talking 10 years, which is not a bad time scale. This is what Google's DeepMind have done. So they've actually produced, using deep learning as well as modeling, as well as computer modeling and other information they put in, they produced a tool called AlphaFold, which actually won the competition for predicting protein folding last year. And so they can actually predict them with reasonable accuracy, better than anybody else, how these proteins fold up. So you have an analysis of the protein, but the physical 3D structure is extremely important in its functionality, and this is what they can actually go and do. So right, so that's one. So can we do similar things? This uses deep learning and it uses all sorts of other information. Can we produce similar things which will really make breakthroughs in science using AI? That's one example. These are some of the things that they put down: expected scientific impacts, acceleration of discovery rates, so actually making scientific discoveries more quickly from this deluge of data, from simple automation of experiments where you can just have a robot putting the target in, to actually more goal-directed. You have these self-driving laboratories, surrogates and simulation, comprehensive transformation of the way we support science, and the operations and the software would be fairly generic, and you could use it at any experiment in any laboratory. And of course, you could then specialize for specific instruments and so on. And you also have intelligent interfaces to the data, to the literature, where you should understand what the paper was saying. You could know what the data was, and it was not just an ignorant way of accessing the literature. So just to finish then, this is the sort of a vision of a self-driving laboratory. You see that there are very few people there, and so it has implications for how much. It tells me my internet connection is unstable. I think I know that. But that's their vision of a self-driving laboratory. This is Jim Gray's vision of the future, that you have literature, that you write papers as we do now, and we have data sets which the paper depends on, and we actually have a mechanism of publishing the data sets, so you can go from the paper to the data that was used to do it. You can combine your data and get and new results, new insights, and go from literature, computation to data back and forth. And so he felt that in the future, there would be all the data and the literature online. And by using AI and machine learning techniques, you will be able to make this a very intelligent system and increase the velocity of scientific information generation and increase hugely scientific productivity. There are rumors that I hear that only a small fraction of the data actually taken at these facilities is ever looked at or actually analyzed. And so we really could do better. And so I think it's a really exciting future, and there will be different types of jobs. But I do agree that AI won't replace the scientists, but I think the scientists will need to know what they can be done with AI and what's reliable, what works, what doesn't work, and how they should use it. So I apologize for the break in transmission, but I'm now back online. So that's all. Thank you very much.